the 1910s and 20s coincide. That is exactly when this proliferation of monuments are erected to the Southern Confederate generals and icons, exactly in that time frame.
Yeah, that is true. And again, we are going to see other groups that are going to come along. We're not going to get into a lot of this stuff during the Civil Rights era, just because that's going to go beyond. But we're going to see in the 30s other groups and other organizations that are going to represent a lot of the interest of the Klan, and in opposition to Roosevelt dominantly. That's going to be a new element that we're going to see.
So it sounds like the Klan has competition now.
Yes.
And so these other groups' marketing was better than the Klan's was at this point. It's kind of like they got a bigger market share of the people.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. All right.
Welcome to the United States of Amnesia. You found us. Thank you. We are the podcast that reminds us of what we have forgotten. It is often said that history repeats itself. Mark Twain allegedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Ecclesiastes probably said it best in chapter 1, verse 9, quote, "Everything that has been will be again. Everything that has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun," close quote. But over time, many topics have become clouded by biases and oversimplifications, or have become mythologized and now are misunderstood. Misunderstanding means learning the wrong lessons from history, perhaps, or even learning nothing at all. And that can leave us poorly prepared for history's next rhyme. Your hosts are Marshall Newman, Mike Mendenhall, and myself, Blake Henke. In this podcast, we will cover topics of history, politics, and religion, and how they interact, and also how they relate to modern-day events and themes. We will try to cut through the biases, oversimplifications, and myths to learn better lessons from the past and to see what they can tell us about the present and maybe even the future. This episode 4 of our America First series is going to be a deep dive into the mid-1930s.
So we do have a lot of doubling down, though, on sort of racial policies during this period. We are seeing lynching happening across the United States, and there is a long, extremely long time frame that we see for attempts to pass a federal non-lynching bill. Now, I'm just going to say it is not to Roosevelt's credit that he did not get behind this anti-lynching movement. Eleanor most definitely did. There were very progressive congressmen and senators that were in favor of this. But this became a kind of doubling down that we saw on a kind of racial politics during the 1930s. Roosevelt did not want to get into any dispute with the South. Now, the South has a tendency, and we will get into this in a later broadcast or a later episode, how the South can affect progressive movements here. But the South became kind of problematic with the New Deal, particularly when it meant the New Deal applied to a decreasing number of Southern blacks as well as Southern whites, and with matters of pay and so forth. And this federal law banning lynching, I mean, we are talking, extrajudiciary methods here. We are talking people being executed without, judicial process here, which is kind of this kind of element that we see with kind of America First, that we can do things without necessarily involving, troubling the law about them.
Extrajudicial punishment.
Yes, and very easy, and no burden of proof whatsoever.
None at all.
On the accusers here. I mean,
you look like the guy that did it.
Yeah.
Or you look like the kind of guy that would do it.
Yeah.
Which often had to do with, race and all
Yeah.
sorts of things like
Well,
that.
like a big
Yeah.
case that existed during the 30s that I'm just going to mention was the Scottsboro Boys, in which this group of African American youths were accused of raping these two white women. And this was a cause célèbre amongst people who were part of the nascent civil rights movement in the North, definitely in the North. But the practice of lynching, though, was actually seen in some quarters as a positive good. There was one senator from my home state of Louisiana who basically defended lynching by saying, "We shall at all costs preserve the white supremacy of America." And that was what lynching was regarded as being able to do here, you know. But to move on here, so the New Deal was able, and maybe we should talk about what the New Deal was able to accomplish before moving on to its critics here, which are going to suck up some of these anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic groups here. They had a number of approaches to problems. Now, some are going to be more effective than others. I will, to my dying day, say the best thing that Roosevelt did was to reform banking and the stock market, because this stabilized this very jittery component of the U.S. economy. It does not get the credit that it deserves, in my opinion. But it's, again, we don't see this happening where we have these periodic collapses. And if you want to know what I mean, 2008, that is an example of what happens when you get rid of these protections. We did not have anything like that. I mean, for the three of us, it's like we did not witness anything like that. I mean, the closest that we come to something like that are the energy shocks of the 70s. That is the closest we get to something like this. Something like 2008, that was kind of scary for a while there, in which it looked like all the banks are going to melt down. And kind of like this was the government not doing its job here because they felt like, oh, we need to impose some cost on unsavory business practices. This did not happen for, I mean, we kind of had this in the 80s with the savings and loan crisis, but we did not have a full-scale meltdown until we start getting rid of these things that Roosevelt put in there.
And the funny thing about that is a lot of the people who advocate getting rid of these things, right?
Yes.
They don't like restrictions on business. It's a restriction on freedom. If you just trust the wealthy and the titans of industry, they'll do the best thing for everybody, and that'll create jobs. Because they'll create jobs and whatever they say.
Overseas.
But well, then there's that. But I mean, the other thing about it is that you need to have a stable financial environment in which to do business.
Yes.
And everybody benefits from that. If I can't trust my bank and I'm going to keep all my money under my mattress, it sits under my mattress. It doesn't get invested anywhere, right? It doesn't earn interest, so I don't make money off interest, so I can spend more on things and buy them from others and whatever. And then companies, they have the same problems, right? They can't rely on whatever money they've got stashed away. It might disappear on them. And on and on and on. I mean, a stable business environment requires a stable financial environment. And so the idea that, well, you're less free and you're worse off, this doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, having depositors insurance, which also comes out during this period,
yes.
It's like my great-grandparents ended up losing everything they had earned over 40 years of being in this country when their local bank in Kingsville, Texas, went out of business. They kept their money in a box under his bed, and they refused to take it down to the bank, and they paid cash for everything, like for houses. If they did not finance anything because they were too suspicious of what had happened before, and they had to go through and rebuild everything.
Right. You see that in the bank run scene in It's a Wonderful Life.
Yes.
Right? That's what was happening in the country.
Yes. And when that movie was made, that was within living memory.
It was a very close memory. I mean, that was only 10 years earlier.
I mean, and if you talk to people from that period and they talked about banks failing, you would see a kind of panic, paling, just just absolute fear going over them just to recall this, where everything that you had can be wiped away. You know, then to talk about some other things that kind of, were useful that didn't necessarily make things better for people who were opposed to the New Deal. Social Security, the big one, collective bargaining. This was the absolute horror for most of business America. Having labor able to negotiate living wages when they were used to having all these lovely immigrants coming in and being able to like pit them against each other, so they would fight over, say, like miserable wages where the whole family had to work just to keep body and soul alive. Rural electrification, which changed things significantly for people, because at the time it was considered not economically viable for private companies to run power lines out to farms. So essentially people are living with kerosene lamps and wood-burning stoves up through the 30s, where people in the cities could basically, they took these sorts of things for granted. So these things changed things for the better. I'm going to say, though, the New Deal did nothing to preserve the family farm. I mean, and this is what's ironic. For the New Deal, they felt like the key to the economy was fixing rural America. If we can get the farms back up and profitable and farming becomes kind of something that people are doing, they felt like this was going to make the biggest difference. There were things like price controls. There were attempts just kind of like notoriously go in and eliminate farm animals to raise the prices up. It did not stop the trend away from people moving to cities, moving to towns. It did not preserve this sort of idea of yeoman farming. And, as you and I can testify, thank God our families left, our respective members, the family left rural America and went, your grandfather, my grandmother, thank God, thank you for leaving, because it's not a very easy life. And I don't know whether this was actually something that was worth preserving. We get into like economies of scale here when you start having these large organizations. I mean, if you look at Grapes of Wrath, these guys are considered to be the enemy, but this is all the people that are setting up these sort of highly mechanized farm structures and such. But I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. Maybe price supports might not be the best thing, but anyway.
Farming was a bigger part of the national economy in the 1930s.
Yes, it was.
So it's not just dumb to say we have to get farmers back on their feet, because that was a more significant part of the economy then than it would be today.
Yes.
I'm not talking about the importance of feeding ourselves. Don't get me wrong on that. But how big a contribution to the overall economy is it? It was a bigger proportion in those days.
Yes.
I'm not sure what the proportion was, but it was bigger, and it probably made more sense to try to get them back on their feet, back then. Right?
Yes.
Is all I'm saying.
Yeah, it does make sense, but it's kind of like you're dealing with kind of the forces of history, I would argue, at this point, where you're dealing with, first of all, the after effects of overproduction from World War I, overextension in terms of credit, and also the fact that you're not needing all of these small family farm organizations to grow sufficient food to feed America. You can still do so when you've got fewer farmers, more machinery to be able to kind of like limit the number of people you need. So just as I think the figure right now for people that are involved in that is 3%. I don't know what the figure was for 1930, but for 1920 it was 40% of the population.
Yeah, so that was my point. Right?
Yeah.
So a lot of people are relying on it. I'm just looking at some stats here real quick. 30.4 million people lived and worked on farms in 1930. And the country was probably about 150 million people then, or maybe even a little bit less at that point.
Yeah.
So that's a big percentage of
Yes.
the population. There were 6.3 million farms in 1930. And the number of farms peaked at around 6.8 million in the mid-1930s. And then it's been declining gradually ever since then.
I mean, one of the ideas that they had was, and I mean, this sounds nice, But the idea is that you're going to create kind of subsistence farming, and you're going to support subsistence farming, in which case people will earn enough, will produce enough to be able just to support themselves on their farms and no more. Now, I have a problem with that because there's certain things that you cannot produce, you know, unless you're like really, really staffed to do so with equipment and such. Like you're not going to be able to produce clothes unless you've got like looms and things like that. You're not going to be able to, you know, there's things like sugar that you're going to have, you know, unless you're in Louisiana, you're going to have to like buy at the store. I don't see that this actually benefits the people that are attempting it.
But there's a, and as you've talked about previously, you know, the yeoman farmer idea, right? The United States has an emotional attachment to the idea. It still does to this day.
Yes.
Of the small family farm. It's not an argument for economic efficiency. It's not an argument for productivity and anything like that. It's an argument that that family farms just have value in and of themselves by their mere existence, and the loss of family farms is a bad thing, even if it's replaced by, I think you're arguing, you know, more efficient, larger scale operations.
They can feed people cheaper.
But what's always interested me about that argument is, and I'm not making a case against family farms when I say this, but I mean, it's very selective. I mean, there are other industries that have gone out of business or shrunk a lot as things change, you know.
Yeah.
Is there any big sentiment to bringing back all the blacksmiths
Nope.
that there used to be, or, you know, things like that, right? Or the livery stables there used to be, or, you know, whatever? No, because we don't use horses as much anymore as we once did, right? But there's no Blacksmith Support Act or something out
No,
there.
there isn't.
I mean, that doesn't exactly match up, because you can make a very good argument that, you know, food security is important for a country. We have to eat, right? And we don't want to just give away all of our food production to other countries, something like that. We want to grow enough here to eat, right? But we do. In fact, we feed a lot of the world.
Yes, we do.
American agricultural products. So,
You know, the thing about it is, here's something to consider. If we're going to use your example, blacksmith, okay. And I can cite a personal example for this if need be. But say if you're a blacksmith, there are other things you can do if you understand how to like forge metal and shape it into equipment or things like that. There are things you can do. You can go in and do something else.
forge other things.
Forge other things other than horseshoes. You know, if you run a livery stable, you run a garage then. There are in other industries that are, say, being replaced as technology grows, there are other things you can do. So there's not that need to support it. What do you do if you're a farmer? Well, you're an unskilled laborer, which is kind of a step down. If you own your farm, you migrate to the cities, or you go, say, like the Joad family does in Grapes of Wrath, you go and instead of grow things, you pick them out in California. So with the farmers, what's interesting is, while this is not successful, while their approach is not successful, they're getting hit even harder, because what they're doing is they're not only losing ground economically, they're kind of, the choices that they have are less viable. They're a step down for them than they would have had during the days when they owned their farm, even as miserable as those conditions were.
Welcome back. All right, now we're going to talk about some of the movements that sprang up in opposition to the New Deal.
So, while the New Deal did stabilize the economy, it did not completely eradicate dissent on the right or the left. So one movement that existed, that came into being, was the Communist Party. Now this, probably not as much as collective bargaining, was something that inspired fear on the part of America's haves. It was never really a national organization. And like so many of these organizations, it's going to be prominent in many niches around the country. For the Communist Party, I don't know how this would work in every case, but in some cases, according to at least one of my professors that told me this back in the 80s, he claimed that the party was somewhat ubiquitous in terms of student movements and universities back during the 30s. If you wanted to have one, you kind of had to involve the Communist Party in whatever activities you were trying to promote, like something like the chess club, something as innocuous as that. So there's also, and again, this is filling that void that's left by the departure from the scene, at least temporarily, of the Ku Klux Klan, and these are pro-Nazi inspired organizations. And these are not necessarily pro-Nazi in the sense of pro-German Nazi, but kind of more fascist than anything else. They're not reliant on purely local avenues for funding, as we'll see for some of these factors. So another factor that came into play in the 1930s was the attitudes towards the U.S. involvement in World War I. Following Hoover's attack on the World War I bonus marchers in 1932, this kind of represented a coming to understanding about the U.S. role. And this action, this attack on the bonus marchers, probably cost him the election.
So what were the attitudes towards World War I in the 1930s?
Well, it was seen, initially we had gone in there to defend democracy. We'd gone in there to make the world safe for democracy. I mean, even though all of the people who were fighting the war, at least at first, had democratic forms of government, we were basically trying to defend democracy for some reason. I don't think it really meant anything in reality. I think this was a case of us being lost in our propaganda. But the disappointments that came, the world was not a better place necessarily for everybody. In some cases, it was worse. These veterans came back and they couldn't even get a beer. The world was not a better place. And as hard times developed, the idea was that we had been deceived again by these cunning Europeans who are always after an attempt to bamboozle the American population.
I think they, you're talking about making the world safe for democracy and all that stuff, right? And did that really have any meaning? And it's a pretty aspirational, vague kind of a concept, isn't it? But I think it actually has deep roots in the American psychology. And even though in recent decades the United States has been viewed as this conservative power in the world that's opposing the radical left or whatever you want to hear, we actually have been a country which has always been revolutionary in the sense of our own revolution. We've been trying to export our way of doing things around the world since 1776 in various fits or starts, right? Either by taking it over or by influencing things. It's been done in different ways in different eras. But one reason we look down on the rest of the world so much of the time is that they don't do things the way we do it, right?
Yes.
So here we get dragged in by those nasty Europeans into one of their wars, right? And if we're going to do that, we're gonna make Europe and the rest of the world be more like the United States. We're going to export our revolution, right?
Yes.
Well, it didn't work because it turned out the Europeans acted like nasty Europeans again. And that was part of the big disappointment of World War I. And that's what made us isolationist up until World War II, which we're going to get into, I guess, as we go further. But I think you can understand it in that context if you think about the United States trying to export its own way of thinking around the world.
It is, but there is, but I think the disappointment in the aftermath of the war is gonna.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That was part of the disappointment, though, right?
Yeah.
We went over there and didn't accomplish anything. They went right back to being nasty Europeans again. And then the other things you're talking about when they came home and what they experienced here.
Yeah,
right?
they're not, and people are not necessarily finding, particularly in the 30s, things have not gone as according to planned. Things are not better. Things are worse. And again, this is I'm going to argue that this is going to be fueling this nostalgia for this America that never really existed. It's going to make that stronger. The kind of idealized America, small town America, yeoman farmers, that kind of stuff. none of this ever really existed in a point where everybody is benefiting equally from that kind of existence at the time here. If anything, people are going to be more likely to be benefiting more universally, but again, not everybody, after World War II, where things are going to, there will be things that will be put into play that will make things a lot better for everybody, but nothing was done. It was just going to sort of spontaneously happen. The world was going to be a better place, and it wasn't. So, kind of as part of this resentment, a focus of U.S. diplomacy during its isolationist period, because even though we were isolationists, we still had relations with the world. And it was basically to get money that was owed to the United States to collect debts from World War I in countries that were facing economic hard times. This was something Roosevelt was doing. This was something that Hoover was doing. This was something Coolidge was doing. This was a main focus of people's attitudes towards the Europeans. It's like, come on and pay up. You've had your time to do this. So this is going to be, kind of affecting our view towards the outside world here. We're dealing with not only sinister people, but sinister deadbeats. And the only nation, and this would affect our attitude towards it, was Finland, that managed to pay off its debts up until World War II. So we had a positive attitude towards Finland when the Russians invaded them. However, the thing that really, if we want to look at what really kind of shaped attitudes, and this is going to affect our participation and involvement in World War I immensely, was the Dies Committee. This was a congressional committee that became known as the Merchants of Death hearings. And they they kind of concluded that U.S. military involvement in World War I was due to the need to preserve the solvency of the Allies so that Eastern banking interest, and it's very important to remember, we are talking just Eastern banking interest. And depending on your attitude, Eastern banking interest controlled by Jewish Americans. However, most of them are actually Protestants. Primarily the House of Morgan. And U.S. arms dealers would get paid by these debtor nations, the allies of World War I. So no one seemed to recall the importance of the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare or the Zimmermann telegraphs, things that we talked about previously. The hearings produced a very long and sordid report of intrigues, bribery, collusion, and excessive profits, of war scares, artificially fostered, and disarmament conferences that were deliberately wrecked. This was kind of foreign affairs as one great long conspiracy to support a small group of Eastern financial interest. This led to the passage of the various Neutrality Acts, and what the Neutrality Acts did was they were continually updated throughout the 1930s, but the idea was to restrict U.S. trade, particularly in the realm of armaments and anything that would support the making of war, the waging of war, in the 1930s. We were not able to really sell or offer any sort of support to anyone resisting fascism. It kind of took us off the board, but it also limited our influence to be able to counter, these attempts by the Nazis, by the Italians, to be able to shape the climate over in Europe and actually destabilize things.
Did the Dies Committee offer any evidence for its reasoning behind the idea of this big conspiracy?
They did have people that did talk about the importance of these loans and things, and they were a factor, but they didn't really look. They came at this with a preconceived notion of what the outcome was going to be. This is that this was again this sort of conspiracy theory of U.S. diplomacy, and they didn't look at the kind of real geopolitical factors that are actually, I mean, I don't know that they necessarily had the benefit of looking at the actual papers where this is being discussed at a higher level, but there's this notion that had persisted that there were excessive profits that were being made, there were war profiteers, and the war profiteers story was something that people made money off war, regardless of whether they were the Central Powers or the Allies. There were people that were doing that because, hey, that's the big business in town. So if these things are going to happen, this is going to be a concern for Roosevelt. When Roosevelt is coming in and trying to rearm America, he's basically coming out there and saying, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to raise taxes so there's not going to be excessive profits by war profiteers. This is going to kind of shape the environment. And also it's going to affect how we're going to be able to go about dealing with the road to war and how we basically prop up France and Britain when they go to war with Germany.
So it's the typical conspiracy theory problem where the holders of the theory are unable to have more than one idea in mind as the cause of things at the same time.
Yeah.
You know? So for all sorts of historical, political, ethnic, social, whatever reasons, World War I breaks out. And it just so happens that when a war like that breaks out, a lot of people can make money and can provide loans and all these things that they're complaining about, right? It doesn't mean that the war happened in order to allow the loans and things. It simply is an observation that loans and profiteering or whatever happened because a war had started.
Yes.
But no, you have to find out that, well, the reason the war started was to result in those things,
I mean,
loans and profiteering and whatever, Eastern banking interests, I mean, you don't have to have the one that, you could have a war start and then people dive in and make money off it.
Yes.
But, conspiracy theories never work that way. It's always got to be that the result is because of some kind of cause beforehand.
I mean, in point of fact, the government had, the elected government had considerable leverage over business during World War I. And despite the fact that the Dies Committee is going to come up and say, well, industrialists are pulling the strings, I would argue quite the contrary, that is not happening. And there are various anecdotes that illustrate, there's a case where Roosevelt was having a dispute with a gentleman who owned a shipyard, one Joseph P. Kennedy. And Roosevelt wanted these ships as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he basically got the Marines to go on board and took the ships from the shipyard. He is not concerned about the impact, and he never would be, of Joseph P. Kennedy on things that he could do. If anything, Kennedy was somebody he would generally work around here. So while these events are occurring in the United States, why don't we turn our attentions to Charles Lindbergh? Because Lindbergh's going to start playing a bigger and bigger role in things as the 30s progresses here. So Lindbergh is the most admired person in the world at this point. And sympathy is exerted towards him after the kidnapping and murder of his eldest son. Lindbergh,
1932.
Yeah, 1932.
Yeah.
This was probably, if I were going to say what was a crime of the century, that would be the crime of the century, because it's basically you're dealing with a child, an infant, someone that was actually in a crib. In fact, Lindbergh was afraid that his son had climbed out of the crib when they couldn't find him. So we're talking about very young child. Very attractive family, heroic family, very prominent in
international celebrity.
International celebrity, and he's spirited away by this, German guy. and this was kind of like a hugely celebrated crime, and it took a bit of time to basically track down Bruno Hauptmann, the guy who was accused of kidnapping and convicted of kidnapping and murdering Lindbergh's child. So it's very easy to sympathize with the right people. There's very little ambiguity in this case as to who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. But Lindbergh is constantly being beset by the press. He had additional children, and kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Lindbergh's child was being brought home from school. A group of reporters kind of like encircled him, almost like Princess Diana. If you want to think of a modern counterpart, Lindbergh's whole family was like Princess Diana, because you had reporters that would routinely chase them to get pictures, and even to the point of endangering everybody.
Well, after his Atlantic flight, he did make other less spectacular, but nonetheless at the time pretty spectacular flights down into Mexico and South America and all sorts of things like that. Everywhere he went, in foreign countries as well, he drew gigantic crowds.
Yes, and he built the aviation industry. It is not, he is one of the great pioneers. He develops routes. He develops ideas about how one can grow commercial aviation. I mean, like, one thing that Lindbergh discovered famously was that blue lights can be seen through fog. He discovered this, and so you see this at airports today, that they'll use them to sort of indicate landing areas and this still is something that he's done today. He's very influential, but he's finding life in the United States, particularly after the kidnapping, somewhat scary. And so he decamps to Europe. He initially is over in Britain. He rents a house from his father-in-law, Dwight Murrow's biographer, a guy named Harold Nicholson. And he also takes up with a guy named Dr. Carrel. Dr. Carrel was a proponent of eugenics. And he thought Lindbergh was the ideal Nordic specimen. Lindbergh is of Swedish descent here, and Carrel thinks that he's just wonderful. I mean, Carrel is involved in other things other than eugenics, but this is kind of the thing to kind of take on board here in terms of influence. I think that what happens with Lindbergh is trying to avoid all this publicity and attention. But I cannot think for a moment that he does not become affected by it. He is constantly being deferred to. He is constantly, if Lindbergh shows up at a bank, you can bet that the president's going to invite him to have lunch with him and sit down and talk to him. And Lindbergh is going to be looked upon by foreign governments wherever he goes as an important person. And as a result, Lindbergh was certainly well connected. He got to observe events in Europe at firsthand. He came to some interesting conclusions we'll get into later. Lindbergh's father, as we mentioned at the opening, was a congressman. And as a child, he used to play in Capitol Hill. This is not the average American person here who's doing this. He marries Anne Morrow, whose father was a partner in the House of Morgan, again the House of Morgan, an ambassador to Mexico, and also an intimate of President Calvin Coolidge. You can't get much better than this as far as being socially prominent and politically prominent. He's a best-selling author. His book We, which was his initial stab of we referred to him and his aircraft, was a best-selling book. He was awarded the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Flying Cross by his father-in-law's best friend, Calvin Coolidge. Lindbergh was always a welcome presence wherever he went. He was always interested in aviation developments when he was abroad here. While in Nazi Germany, this would come back to haunt him in a big way. He received the Order of the German Eagle from no less than Hermann Göring. And Lindbergh was not the sort of person who, at this point, when he's getting this in the 30s, Lindbergh has gotten so many freaking decorations. This is just like one more ornament on the Christmas tree as far as he's concerned. Other people would say that when Lindbergh became more of a pronounced isolationist, this decoration would haunt him in the sense that people would assume that he'd been bought by this decoration. Lindbergh put it in his pocket and didn't really think about it, and I'm not even sure he was aware of what it was, because this was just not the sort of thing he cared about. Now, a new carburetor or a new engine on an aircraft, yeah, that would get his attention. But a new decoration, that was not his thing here. That was not what he was interested in doing here. But like I said, a lot of accusations would say this is how the Nazis brought Lindbergh into the tent.
When did Goering give him the award?
I want to say it would be like 36.
Right.
He was on a tour of Germany, and they were at some event, and Goering actually gave him the award at the event. And this was the Order of the German Eagle. But again, Lindbergh had, a whole closet full of medals and awards and citations that he'd gotten from other countries. Critics of Lindbergh would say this medal made him the tool of Nazi Germany. Lindbergh is not going to emerge from this as a praiseworthy figure. Very deeply flawed, but there are certain accusations which I'm going to say were probably not fair at all in terms of how you characterized him. One thing that Lindbergh got away with, just because of his status, Lindbergh was assumed to have insight into military capabilities by leading figures around the world. Anytime Lindbergh shows up somewhere, be it Capitol Hill, be it at a bank, or any place else, they're going to sit around and talk about military affairs and military strategy. And if you look at Lindbergh's diaries, Lindbergh he understands characteristics and performance of aircraft probably better than anybody else. He could basically look and they'd show him an engine and he would be able to deduce this is what this is going to enable to happen here. What he doesn't understand about he doesn't really understand about anything once you get him beyond aviation. But he was given credit for having insight into these things. He doesn't really understand sea power if you look at some of the things that he's talking about in his diaries. He doesn't really understand land forces at all. He doesn't really seem capable of assessing change that could occur as a result of wartime in terms of production. He's basically assuming, okay, what I'm observing here is going to be a straight line. There's not going to be any difference or alterations in what this particular country can accomplish in terms of aircraft production or even innovation in the future. I mean, things that happened in aviation during World War II are nothing short of amazing. You start off with relatively primitive planes and you end up with jets. This is probably not something that Lindbergh could have envisioned here. But again, he is given credit for having extraordinary insights into all aspects of war. Now, Lindbergh's understanding of himself as this military authority is going to cloud his ideas for how and what would happen during World War II, as we will see. He's not really a strategy guy. He thought that the war would begin in the Eastern Mediterranean, not on the Western Front. He felt like that was where the initial stages would happen. I don't know why he would imagine that.
Involving who?
Britain, Germany, Italy, France, they'd all be fighting this out in the Eastern Mediterranean. There were colonies there, but I'm just not clear as to why you would imagine this.
World War I started in the Balkans, so maybe he's thinking history will repeat itself, or rhyme in some way when it'll start in that same general area again. I don't know.
I don't know either. And I mean, when I came across this, I actually found some books on Lindbergh that I looked at, and they cite his diaries, and I found excerpts from the diaries, and it's basically like, this is where I'm getting my understanding of his beliefs. It's what he wrote down and what other biographers have seen fit to cite subsequently. We're going to come back to Lindbergh later on, but let's go back to the United States and see what's happening politically over there. Back in the United States, by about 1934, particularly when the banks stopped failing, the economy is stabilized. It's not good. We still have 1/3 of the nation ill-housed and ill-fed, in the words of Franklin Roosevelt. But things had stopped going downward. The term America First is being embraced by a whole host of anti-New Deal organizations and foes. Now, I'm just going to admit a bias towards Roosevelt, and I'm going to say, fortunately, none of these critics had the means of being able to channeling discontent into a single organizational effort. We're going to see throughout the 30s, one of the, it's not so much, to quote Gore Vidal, the guy whose essay, The United States of Amnesia, gives this podcast its name. It is not so much for people to succeed, but others must fail. And in the case of FDR's foes, people failed spectacularly, at least through the early part of the 1930s. So this lack of a coherent opposition was really good for FDR and for promulgating the programs of the New Deal. But these forces would reconstitute themselves over and over again, and this would lead up to they would be kind of precursors to the America First Committee, which we're going to look at towards the end of this particular podcast, and kind of will be the focus of it. The ideas and what they represented might have lacked an organization to give them real structure, but these are kind of ideas that we saw in the 20s and would see perpetuated in the 30s by a host of different organizations and different focuses there.
So the America First idea becomes opposed to the New Deal.
It is opposed to the New Deal, and there's a lot of reasons that they're opposed to the New Deal. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, and I mean, I know we're not supposed to be talking about literature, but John O'Hara has a great story about a guy who, at Harvard, was denied admission to one of the more exclusive clubs there. He is either Catholic or Jewish, it's not clear, but he has risen in substance in the New Deal, in the organization. Roosevelt is alluded to, he's referred to as the boss in the story. And he's having lunch with a friend who's kind of fallen on hard times, and he needs this job. He's one of the old elite, the old order that, had been kind of displaced by the high taxes that Roosevelt is imposing in order to pay for the New Deal. He needs a government job. He basically is coming to this guy on bended knee, and then at a certain point in the story, he reverts to type and basically tells him that he would never have been able, he never belonged really at a place like Harvard or in this particular club. And thereby, guess what? He doesn't get the job that he desperately needs. And what O'Hara is saying is that there are these people who are insisting on these class distinctions are doing so to their detriment. But let's look at America First organizations themselves. There is one called America First, and this is distinct from the anti-involvement in World War II organization, and this is by a guy named James True. And his goal was to expose the propaganda and subversion that was being conducted by FDR and the New Deal. He believed that this was a way of getting us to socialism and communism through the back door here. So we also have a leading New Deal critic, Father Coughlin, the radio priest. Now, initially, Coughlin is a supporter of Roosevelt in 1932, but because New Deal policies had undermined his economic portfolio, Father Coughlin became absolutely rabid as opposed to the the New Deal. Then as now, we have members of the clergy who seek to serve both Caesar and God, and Father Coughlin was one of them. Coughlin was kind of like the Tucker Carlson of the day, without urging followers to tan their testicles. Coughlin's obsession was a fight against what he called the Jew Deal, or his term for FDR's New Deal.
And he had a huge listenership, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And he initially was on CBS, and he was kicked off CBS because he became increasingly controversial. And they felt uncomfortable with this, and he was able to cobble together, because of his own popularity, a sort of like ersatz network, kind of a syndication effort that allowed him to maintain a national presence until eventually his superiors just said, enough is enough, you're a priest, you're not supposed to be going on there and discussing politics here. This is not part of your pastoral mission. But he had been very successful. He had kind of managed to raise a lot of money for his church up in Detroit. He was Canadian, which kind of limited his ability to be able to participate in U.S. politics. So he could not, there was a lot of talk about trying to come up with somebody to oppose FDR. One person in the 1936 election, that person was not going to be Father Coughlin because he was a Canadian, he was foreign-born, and he couldn't run. That would have been kind of interesting to see a priest run for president, but this was something people did entertain as an idea until they realized this was impossible constitutionally.
So the New Deal he called
the Jew Deal.
The Jew Deal. And so here we are again.
Yes.
Where that's, Jews are somehow foreign and not really American.
Yep.
Now we're combining that with this whole thing about, I suppose the old trope, they control the money and the bank, whatever, right?
Well, now they control the government.
And apparently FDR is a secret Jew controlling the government, right? As we talked about earlier, and all this stuff, right? So it's, more things change, the more they say the same.
Well, you see what we're seeing here. I mean, if we're looking at kind of a focus for like hostility towards, say, immigrants or people who are not Americans of long standing here, it's going to kind of focus, like today, it's people from Latin America. Back in the 30s, nobody even thought about this as a problem. Nobody thought that, okay, we're having people from Central and South America coming here, so that's going to be a problem.
As we talked about before, the Immigration Acts didn't restrict Latin American.
No, it didn't. It didn't. And there wasn't an issue with that back then. What the issue was Europe. People who now would be regarded somewhat innocuously were seen to be this threat that were undermining the American way, American culture, etc. If anything, just given prominent people who were Jewish at the time, someone like Irving Berlin, who's Jewish, he writes "God Bless America." So how more patriotic can you be with a song entitled "God Bless America"? Yet these people are insisting that people that are Jewish are somehow not as good and not as loyal. But you have this, as an example.
It doesn't matter how much evidence there is to the contrary. They're just going to believe what they're going to believe, aren't they?
Yes. So in addition to Father Coughlin, we have Louisiana Senator and also Governor Huey Long, who was a more literate version of Donald Trump. Like, to Huey Long's credit, he was able to get a law degree in under a year by basically just self-education. He was a great talker, great promiser, a real son of a bitch, too. But he also was not above using all sorts of tropes to, like, scare people and to urge a kind of fascist approach to government. He relied on the support of aggrieved, ignorant, rural America to win him support, and he was well on his way to establishing a national organization, the Share Our Wealth organization, which was kind of socialist because he was going to go in and liquidate private fortunes. Anybody who had more than $5 million was out of luck kind of a contrast to Trump there. But everybody was going to get a house, a car, and a radio. They were going to be insured that as a sort of minimum amount of property that this liquidation of great fortunes was going to bring about. His goal was to split the Democratic Party between himself and Roosevelt to ensure the election of a Republican in 1936. Long felt that if you brought in a Republican, he was just going to screw up the Depression further, and then by 1940, if not before, people would be ready for a change. And by before, that meant that you could have him leading a somewhat violent revolution. Long famously said that he fully expected the U.S. Capitol, this is when he's senator, that was going to be attacked by angry mobs, and his big problem was whether he was going to stay in the Senate or go out and join them. So again, we have a lot of Trumpian elements in Huey Long here. Huey Long was killed by his bodyguards during an assassination attempt. They were not attempting to assassinate him. They were literally the gang that couldn't shoot straight, and they ended up shooting Huey Long instead of his assassin. He got killed too. When I was a child, when we go to the state capitol, I still have the bullet holes in the marble walls of the Louisiana State Capitol, and you can go over and look at them. They didn't bother to take them out. His passing kind of left a huge gap in the opposition to Roosevelt.
It's interesting to me to hear you talk about Huey Long and what he wanted to do for people, supposedly, right?
Yes.
What was it? A radio and what else?
Radio, a house, and a car.
And a car. Everybody gets one.
Everybody
right?
gets one.
What's kind of interesting there is in these right-wing movements,
yeah,
you see it over and over again, even though they're so opposed to socialism, there nonetheless is a socialistic aspect to it, right? They're going to give everybody things.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure they're only going to give it to people they approve of.
Yeah.
Not really everybody, right? But they're going to give people things, I guess, for free.
Yeah.
In this case, which, it's this incoherent mindset, right?
I'm going to get a car.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you one, even though I'm against socialism.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, he wasn't necessarily against socialism, but he called it something else.
This is getting to my point, though, right? You often hear right wingers talk about they're against socialism, right? And we've talked a lot about on this pod here about how this socialism was this strange European thing that was going to undermine America and everything, right? And yet there are certain aspects of it that they keep embracing over and over again.
With populist movements.
With populist movements. And, people get tired of people comparing to Nazis and things. And I'm not saying Huey Long was a Nazi. But it's interesting when you think about that the Nazis party's name is National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? NSDAP was their thing. You got socialists in there. You got workers in there, right?
Yeah.
That's not socialism in the leftist sense, but it's a kind of socialism where it's like we're for the workers and we're going to give them things, but on a nationalist basis, in their case, right? Nationalist, which means that we're going to do these things, but for a certain group of people in our country.
The good, right-living people.
The good, right-living people who, look like us and things that we approve of. We're going to do these socialistic things, but only for them. And that makes it okay.
Yes. Well, my favorite historian, who a lot of left-wing historians don't like him, but I have become a born-again fan of Richard Hofstadter, who looked at various movements. I mean, there are things that Hofstadter kind of talks about, like what we're talking about today, not anything directly. But Hofstadter really hates populist movements. And for him, populist movements are things like the Nazis. That is kind of his template. And he's also looking at proponents of the Red Scare, also populist. Where Hofstadter gets into a lot of trouble with left-wing historians is that there is the sort of populist movement that happened in the 1890s, which starts out well and good and intent on helping everybody, but then it becomes increasingly anti-Semitic and racist. And that's and his conclusion is that this is where these movements eventually end up. They end up going in this direction. And he makes a big distinction between movements like that and progressive movements, which are about institutions, which are about, maintaining and reforming the civilization or society. And so he would have a problem, say, with these populist movements and populism. He had no problem with progressivism. He had no problem with the New Deal. He saw this as like on a sound legal basis, and it doesn't necessarily depend upon emotional reactions from people to further its goals there. And I think these are things to keep in mind as big distinctions when you're looking at how certain movements operate and what they are about here.
That's it for this episode of the United States of Amnesia. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we hope you discovered new ways of looking at things you had already heard or thought about, or perhaps hadn't heard about. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If we made you mad, that's okay too. Either way, email us at usa.amnesia@gmail.com and let us know what you think. Also, let us know about anything you think we missed or got wrong. We'd like to know about that too. And of course, please like and subscribe and let your friends and neighbors know about us. We also have a website. It's www.usofamnesia.com. For Marshall, Mike, and myself, till next time.